He was at the peak of his DJ career, making a massive difference in helping shape hip-hop when his life was tragically taken away from him. Scott LaRock, a member of Boogie Down Productions, was born on March 2, 1962 in South Ozone Park, Queens. It was a rather peaceful neighborhood, far from the grim and gloomy place that would mold Scott later in his life. His early childhood was not as bright as his parents split when he was only 4 years old. After that, he was living with his mother, Carolyn Moran, a career municipal employee. Later, with his mother, Scott moved to the Morrisania section of the Bronx, and after that to Morris Heights. Scott was attending Our Savior Lutheran High School, where he was a successful student, not only in his academic pursuits, but in sports as well. He graduated in 1980 and started his education at Vermont's Castleton State College. He was a part of the college's basketball team, but it soon became evident that he didn't have a future in the NBA. So, Scott switched his focus from basketball to music. A roommate of Scott LaRock, Lee the Mag Smith Jr., stated that our turntables were on our desks and our books were on the floor. I would come home and hear the bass before I opened the door. In 1984, after graduating from college, Scott LaRock came back to New York in hopes of finding work and finding his way into the music industry. Thanks to the help of his mother, Scott was given a job at the Franklin Armory Men's Shelter, which was on 166th Street in the Bronx. Having a day job didn't stop him from his musical endeavors, in which he was progressing playing in the Broadway Repertoire Theater on 145th Street. Thanks to his developed social skills, progressive business sense, and pure magic that he was making on the turntables, Scott LaRock earned a reputation. DJ Red Alert, while asked about Scott, said, "He was just a smooth, approachable brother. He could relate to any type of person. That's why so many people gravitated to him." The more Scott worked on the turntables, the more he wanted to make his own. So he began studying the art of making beats at his friend Sed G's space and looking for a worthy MC partner in numerous clubs. But when he did find the better half of the later duo, it was not in the clubs, but right in the shelter where he was working. Among the numerous responsibilities that Scott had at the shelter was giving away subway tokens to those who were traveling to job interviews. It took him some time to figure out that a few of the residents were not going to any job interviews, but instead were saving those tokens to go to parties. One time, Scott confronted one of the said people, and it was rather loud. There was some verbal altercation that resulted in the resident being forced from the premises of the shelter. That man was KRS-One, 20 years old at the time, with a cocky attitude and passion for graffiti and philosophy. A few months after that incident, Scott ran into KRS-One again when he was visiting his friend Sed G. KRS was there to practice his newfound passion for music. Having in mind their previous verbal exchange, Scott suggested burning the hatchet and inviting KRS-One to be his partner. After that, Scott asked KRS to come to one of his parties in the Broadway Repertoire Theater. My mind got blown clean out of my head. Just seeing Scott DJing and then watching Mantronics walk by and then Dougie Fresh in the corner grabbing a drink, it was just too much for me. Scott really liked KRS and two more guys from the shelter he was working at, such as Just Ice and ICU later. LaRock tried to be an influence on D-Nice, who was a cousin of a security guard. So I brought my cousin food over at the Franklin Men's Shelter. He was like, "Yo, I want to introduce you to someone." He took me into his office and introduced me to this guy. He was just this tall, dark, towering dude. I was young at the time. I was 15. Even at work, this dude always had a briefcase and short sleeve shirt on, always wearing jeans, white pair of Nikes on, waves in his hair, smiling. He was just full of life and energy. And from that day, we hung out and we went to Dr. J's on 3rd Avenue in the Bronx, and he just started buying me stuff. It was how D-Nice was introduced to Boogie Down Productions. Scott encouraged D-Nice to take his chances in hip-hop, even though D-Nice at the time did not have the same visualization of things as Scott had. Also, Scott was trying to persuade D-Nice to spend some time educating himself. In a 1987 interview, KRS-One recalled that,
Scott worked for the Franklin Men's Shelter, and me and BDP Posse was in there, bugging, running around LA. We wasn't like everybody else. We wasn't, most of the people you see inside shelters are usually, they're there because of the bottle, the crack, the needle, whatever it is, they're there for a reason. We were there simply because no one else would believe in us, family-wise.
He'd invite us down, and we'd hang out way past the 9 p.m. curfew, get drunk and party. At the end of the night, Scott would take us all out for breakfast, and we'd talk about who we were going to be and what we were going to do. Scott gained freedom hanging out with us, and being around him made us feel important. The charismatic trio, which consisted of Scott LaRock, KRS-One, and D-Nice, first called themselves Scott LaRock and Celebrity 3, but later changed their name to Boogie Down Productions to honor their home, Boogie Down Bronx. It was the fall in 1985 when Scott LaRock and KRS started recording original music, while the trio was called Scott LaRock and Celebrity 3. They released a single, Advance, that wasn't too successful. After that, Scott saw an ad in the newspaper that Rock Candy Company was looking for a rap talent and decided to give it a try. He met with Rock Candy and sold them the idea of having a subsidiary label, B-Boy Records, that would be run by him and KRS. They would have an office in the Hunt's Point neighborhood in the Bronx and later change their name to Boogie Down Productions, splitting profits equally. Scott and KRS started their recording instantly, making a demo cassette with rough versions of Elementary and Criminal Minded just in a few weeks. Through an engineer in Power Play Studios, Scott had an opportunity to give the tape to DJ Mr. Magic, but Magic didn't really like the material and said it was kind of whack. Later that same week, Scott booked 2 hours at the studio, where KRS set his creative energy free, inspired by that insult. That was how South Bronx was born, a track about regional pride that took shots at DJ Mr. Magic, DJ Marley Marl, Queens, and Juice Crew. I hear all these records about Brooklyn and Queens, and then Shan saying that rap music started in Queens. That's a bunch of bull. I don't like Mr. Magic anyway, so I thought it was time to tell the truth. Then, Scott and KRS released Success Is the Word through Sleeping Bag Records, but they didn't write it or produce it through Boogie Down Productions, so it didn't really have much of an influence. Their rage took the shape of The Bridge Is Over and South Bronx. Mr. Magic tried to diss us one night in the studio a couple months ago, so I said, KRS, let's put out this record. Chris Lighty, who was the leader of Violator, you may also know him as the manager for 50 Cent who helped him get the vitamin water deal, remembered when Scott played him South Bronx for the first time. I was like, damn, we going at him like that? He was just like, yeah, why not? It's a business. What's stopping us? It seemed like an insurmountable mountain at that point, but that was how Scott was. He could make you believe anything was possible. Soon after, Scott and KRS were in the final stages of making their first album, Criminal Minded. It was Said G who helped to craft a revolutionary sound. Me and Scott grew up together, Said told Angus Beatty in 2004. I knew Scott's whole family. With BDP's Criminal Minded, my input was more of showing Scott how to use the sampler. When the SP12 came out, a lot of engineers just looped, but I would take sounds and chop them up. Even if it wasn't a full sound, I'd make it sound full. I was the first person to chop samples on the SP12. Soon after, everyone was doing it. KRS-One would bring the record, I would take it, chop it, rearrange it. I did the whole album, apart from 4 songs. For listeners, KRS shaped and described the reality of the Bronx's crack era mean streets. He rapped about what one needs to do to get money, but at the same time not to cross the line and become criminals themselves. KRS vividly depicted the album cover in one of his interviews in 2010. The idea was revolutionaries. If you look at the cover of Criminal Minded, that's what we were saying modern day Black Panthers are. I had the gun belt going over the shoulder, grenades. That wasn't hood. It wasn't like we had guns on the table like we were drug dealers. We had grenades. Real paramilitary stuff was on the table. We were showing ourselves to be revolutionaries. Gangsters are really intelligent. We're Black Panthers. We're not just dudes on the corner.
The guns and all that?
The guns and stuff. We were posing on the cover of Criminal Minded as revolutionaries. We were coming off Black Panther, coming off of guerrilla warfare, but we doing it in the hood.
D-Nice, while being a member of Boogie Down Productions, was not on the cover of Criminal Minded for a very good reason. He had a lot of disputes with Scott about continuing his education. So Scott put it very simply. D-Nice could not find the inspiration to go to school, so he didn't deserve his place to be in the group. At the beginning of 1987, Criminal Minded was finally released and was met with immediate acclaim, selling about 300,000 copies in the first year of its release. Though Rock Candy turned out not to be the decent partners and they didn't distribute the album properly, there were lots of shady things happening with the album's true sales. So Scott and KRS never really realized or got the exact amount of money that they should have received. Warner Brothers A&R Benny Medina got really interested in the album, so in August, Medina flew Scott and KRS to LA and presented them with $275,000 to sign to the major. Understandably, when Scott and KRS returned to New York, they were really excited and more than ready to announce their move to Madison Square Garden, where they had to perform alongside Public Enemy, LL Cool J, as a part of the Dope Jam tour. Also, they began pre-production of the following tracks, such as My Philosophy, Stop the Violence, and I'm Still Number One for their next album, By All Means Necessary. On the evening of August 26, D-Nice was having some trouble in the Highbridge Hood in the Bronx, where popular modern-day rapper A Boogie with the Hoodie is from, when he was walking with a friend. In a moment, his friend was gone, and D-Nice was surrounded by a lot of not-so-friendly people. One of those people was the guy with whom D-Nice had a prior conflict. That guy pulled a gun and stuck it to D-Nice's face. Rightfully fearing for his life, he called Scott and asked for help. He said, "Yo, I'm gonna come over there and we're gonna find him and we're gonna squash the beef." He was a social worker. His job was to end beef and help solve issues. Prior to that evening, Scott LaRock, KRS, Just Ice, their manager Scotty Morris, and RoboCop, the bodyguard, were in McDonald's on the corner of Broadway and 72nd Street. They finalized the deal earlier that day to produce through Boogie Down Productions and Just Ice's Cool and Deadly album. After we signed the contract, we went to McDonald's. It was all of us, plus RoboCop was with us. They got a call from their young friend and affiliate D-Nice who needed help. RoboCop was like, "We gonna go up there and I'm gonna go get D-Nice." Scott was like, "I'm gonna go with you." Before going straight to the hood, Scott called Lighty and the Violators for some muscle. Two crews met in the South Bronx and then drove to University Avenue, which was between 165th and 166th Street. Despite the person who was threatening D-Nice being nowhere to be seen, his crew was hanging on the block. RoboCop, who was in the car with Scott, went forward and started asking questions about whether the person of interest was there and if anyone saw him. Things turned hostile at the moment, and RoboCop found himself in an altercation with one of the youth and slammed him on the sidewalk. Scott LaRock came close and calmed everything down and then was on his way back to the car. Lighty, who was observing the whole situation, remembered that it seemed like it was mellow. Well, as mellow as some kids that just got smacked up can be. Then, Scott and RoboCop were walking back to the car, and gunfire starts, from the ground level, and it seemed like from a couple levels up too. While it was not really clear who was shooting at them and from where, Violators returned fire, giving time for RoboCop and Scott to jump into the car. According to RoboCop, they were driving, and all of a sudden, Scott grabbed his neck and fell down. His head hit the mother effing dashboard, and you see a hole, and it was a .22. That's what you call a lucky shot, man. If you've ever been to Webster Projects, those buildings are like 17 to 20 stories high. He was on the roof, and he shot him with the little .22. If the wind blows too hard, it'll knock it off course. That day, there was no wind. They tried to get away from the neighborhood as soon as possible, but traffic was jammed due to the shooting. But after some time, they finally made their way to the Lincoln Memorial Hospital and carried Scott LaRock into the emergency room. He was admitted at 11:15 p.m. while bleeding and speaking incoherently. The Violators with their leader arrived around 20 minutes later, unaware of who was hit. When we got there and saw him, it was like watching your own father pass away. Around 2 a.m., Scott completely lost consciousness. In an hour, the doctors declared that he was brain dead, so Scott's mother decided to take him off life support, but not until 5 p.m. the following day so that all his friends would have time to say their goodbyes. MC Setch remembered that day vividly, saying, "He was laying there with his shirt off, with this white towel draped over him, and his arms were out. His wife was on one side and his mother on the other. They were both holding his hands. He was laid out like Jesus on the cross. Both eyes were partially open, and he had tears streaming down his face. Just tears rolling out of both of his eyes. I grabbed his hand, told him how much he meant to me, and he had a nervous reaction like he was grabbing my hand. I lost it. I started bawling. It was like he was trying to tell me so many different things all at once. To me, his body was still holding on." It was August 27, 1987 when Scott LaRock died. It was almost a year later when a few teens in the Bronx were busted by the police for stealing subway tickets. Kendall Newland and Corey Bain were arrested and charged with the murder of Scott LaRock. Newland was living in the apartment building near where the shooting took place. Police officers were puzzled by the lack of witnesses that wanted to testify, so both of them were acquitted at trial on November 15, 1989. From that moment, they were in the wind. Despite that, after Scott's death, Warner Brothers withdrew their contract offer, and Boogie Down Productions found a better place for their music, with Jive Records. Although KRS was then left without his partner, he didn't give up and continued what he started with Scott, though he shifted the lyrics' focus to elevating black consciousness and denouncing the violence.
We all planned our goals. We knew exactly what it is we wanted to do, where it is we wanted to go, and I feel, in a way, us as a group, we don't mourn. We had our chance for mourning. You know, You have that one day, you cry it out, and then that's it. You know, we don't mourn and keep going and keep going, keep going. You know, you celebrate, if anything, you know, because we're advancing constantly. You know what I mean? If we had flopped, then I would be sad that Scott's gone and my career went down the drain and this and that. His son will live what he doesn't have materially, so everything's straight.
The relationship between KRS and D-Nice was never the same because KRS held D-Nice guilty of Scott's death. KRS and I weren't really tight like that. And there's part of me that, although I wanted my brother to understand and see who I am, I couldn't be mad at KRS because Scott was the man who pulled me into the group. KRS never knew what the story was. All he knew now was Scott was dead because he came to my aid. Boogie Down Productions, after some time, resumed the work on the album By All Means Necessary, which was released in 1988. It was again a commercial success and drew even more attention than Criminal Minded. Stop the Violence was the track that KRS used to talk about all the senseless killings that kept happening in his community, including what happened to Scott. Stop the Violence was a freestyle because every time we went to do a show, somebody would start acting stupid. We would have something to say, even as that was going on, because the music never stopped. Scott's death was a push that made KRS promote peace and unity in hip-hop. In 1989, KRS banded together with a lot of stars to record the song Self-Destruction, which was a tribute to Scott LaRock and an important moment in hip-hop. But arguably, the worst situation is that he never got his justice.